Welcome to the fourth in our series of lectures on technology and responsibility, sponsored by the Herbst Program for Humanities for Engineers and the President's Fund for the Humanities. We began this series with a session on professional education and the examined life. And we know if we examine our life according to that session, it should be uncomfortable, right? We then heard about the responsibility through good management of technical resources. Last time, in my absence, you heard about the ethics of arms manufacture. And today we're going to hear about technology and environmental responsibility. The host for this program is Thanasi Moulakis, the Herbst Professor of Humanities. Thanasi, let me call on you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you again to our series. And I wanted to refer briefly to something that one of our speakers on the last occasion said in connection with the usefulness of things like the Herbst Program. This is a plug. One of the things that was mentioned was the relative rarity of engineers making careers in politics. And the two exceptions were mentioned of the two engineers who made it to the presidency of the United States, namely Jimmy Carter and Herbert Hoover. I wanted to point out to those of you who have presidential ambitions that Herbert Hoover was not only a very good engineer, but he was also somebody who, before he became president, was deeply engaged in humanitarian work, one of the most astonishing pieces of work with refugees, a kind of social engagement, another moment where his skills, as it were, as an organizational man and a man who could think straight and yet keep his heart in the right place, was able to effect between the two world wars. I also wanted to say that Herbert Hoover, besides all that, was a man of a classical education besides that of his technical training. He was a very distinguished Latinist and translated, for instance, the early manual on mining and metalwork by a man called Agricola. We have it in the library. It's a beautiful edition, and it is actually a first-piece work of a man conversant with the arts as much as he's with the sciences. So I just want to say that it is our ambition to try to give some dimension of this roundedness to our engineering students, and at the same time we hope to use our program as a stimulus for various parts of the university and the community as a whole to come together in considering issues that concern us all. Today it is the issue of environmental responsibility in connection with technological development and technological education. I'm delighted to welcome our guests, Bill Parzabok, who has come to us from Seattle. He is their executive officer and chairman of the board of Fluke Incorporated. He has been with Hewlett-Packard up the street for many years. He has been deeply involved with the affairs of our institution. He has been he is on the advisory council, on the President's Advisory Council, and on our Engineering Development Council. He is somebody who has already contributed greatly to the improvement that we are doing, that we are attempting in this house. Next to him is David Rowe, who is a man of the law. He is a graduate of a school that has been a lot in the news lately, namely the Yale Law School, for better or for worse. He has devoted his skills to public service. He is legal counsel of the Environmental Defense Fund, which has its seat, or he operates out of its seat in San Francisco. I will not waste any more of their time, and I will give you Bill Parzabok.
Well, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to share some thoughts with you today, and hopefully we'll have some stimulating and provocative discussion about a subject that I think all of us are very interested in, or we wouldn't be here. What I'd like to do is to make basically 6 points, and I'll write them on the board here, as a way to illustrate what I think some of the major issues are here, and some of the themes, and some of the things that are being done in private enterprise. The company I am with, we are a publicly held company. We employ 2,200 people, most of them in Washington State. We have a major commitment to be a responsible citizen, and I'd like to share with you some of the things that we think are important along this line. The first point I'd like to make here is what I call sustainable future. I think as a society, frankly, as a human race on this planet, we need to figure out a way to have a healthy environment and a healthy economy at the same time. I think, by the way, they each impact each other tremendously. Economic health is essential to the environment, in my opinion. And the reason for that is we need to find the funds to clean up previous sins and messes. We need research into new methods and new materials to replace things that we currently use, which are harmful, like CFCs. We need funds from economic health to train people, better education, better recycling. Economic health is important here. How many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Most of you probably have heard of that. It's a very simple concept that says that there's a hierarchy of your needs, and your basic needs are things like food and shelter and clothing. And I've forgotten what the next one up is. Help me. The highest one on the list is self-actualization. The whole theory is that once you're well fed and clothed and have a shelter and everything, then you move up to other things become important to you. But if something happens, you will fall back down the list. Most of you think that it's important to have an intellectually stimulating discussion this afternoon, but if you are all about to starve to death, I will guarantee that you are not going to be real interested in this kind of a discussion. And I guess I've been struck over the years with people who, driving between here and the Wyoming border one time, a pickup truck that says, if you're hungry and out of work, eat an environmentalist. That troubled me because it said to me that somebody operating on a lower level of Maslow's hierarchy will be less sympathetic to some of these issues. It's the Brazilian farmer who says it's really nice for all you folks in the United States to have your kids going to school, but I'm cutting down a forest here so that I can raise some cattle, sell that meat so I can get the money, so I can sometime in my lifetime or my children's lifetime have some approach, some level of standard of living that you all enjoy. So I believe if you have economic disaster, you will have environmental disaster. And I think Eastern Europe is probably the most vivid example today of the giant, incredible mess that they are in over there. Germany is finding out what a big mess that is. I think environmental health is essential for economic health. Maybe not on the very shortest term, because people will cut corners if allowed to on the short term. But on the long term, if you destroy the quality of life, you've heard a lot of things, particularly businesses that employ what I call knowledge workers, which are a growing proportion of industries in this country, electronics, the computer business, and so forth. You simply do not have to locate your factories near an ore body or a port or an airport or a railroad spur. A Hewlett-Packard or a John Fluke or an IBM, they do locate their facilities where people want to live. They look for good quality of life, and if that quality of life is deteriorated, quality of life encompasses a lot of things, of course, but if that is deteriorated, you can't attract people. I know that when I lived here in Colorado, we would fly people in to interview in February and March. And what you didn't want to have them do is driving back into Denver in the late afternoon to see what a mess that was. That was a quality of life issue for people, and it's important. Yeah, I think if you have an unhealthy environment also, you tend to have higher costs. Health insurance costs are a terrible problem for U.S. businesses. Our cost for providing health insurance for our employees is growing much, much faster than our sales. How we pay for this is a struggle for us. Some of those health problems that our employees and other citizens of this country have are going to be, the bill's going to be paid by somebody. So there's a real cost for having an unhealthy environment. So my point here is that we need to, as a society and as a world society, really find ways to do both. I don't see how either one of them can be given total priority over the other and expect it to work. The second point is what I call sound science. Over half of the people in this country believe that astrology is a science. Okay? And that's troubling for anybody who has a scientific or let's say, an education that says that there is science and there is pseudoscience. In the case of sound science, we need to really make sure that we improve our skills in terms of risk assessment. We need to be putting our limited resources, be they dollars or people's time, on those things that have the biggest risks and the biggest potential payoff. I'm not an expert on asbestos, and maybe my colleague on the panel here is. But I remember reading an article in Science magazine that says that if you took the money that was spent to tear asbestos out of schools and office buildings in this country, and all the workers who were exposed to that asbestos in that process, and you spent that money perhaps in a different way to educate people or look for alternatives, you might have had a much better deal. But there was a kind of a ready, fire, aim mentality. Like I say, I'm no expert on asbestos, but there was a public scare about asbestos, and I know asbestos workers were affected. Maybe you know some more details about that. I think we need to figure out how to get people to respect science. We can avoid some costly mistakes because we don't have unlimited resources. We don't have unlimited time. We need to really be sure we're doing the right things. I guess I heard the other day, and somebody closer to this would maybe comment, apparently now the EPA is reconsidering Times Beach and feel like they may have made a mistake in evicting people from Times Beach. Have you followed that? I think that would be interesting to hear about. I don't know who was right on that. But this idea of a ready, fire, aim mentality is really damaging to this whole cause. Just for fun, we brought a little thing. I hope we have enough copies for everybody. We brought a little quiz. You don't have to put your name on this quiz. There's a couple of stacks of them. We just thought it would be interesting to get the sense of the audience here today on what you think are the greatest risks to you and your children. What I'd like to suggest here is that what you have in front of you is a list of 10, at least in some people's opinions, potentially things that would threaten your lifestyle or your life, which I guess is part of your style. This may not be an exhaustive list. You may be tempted to want to add others. What I'd like you to do is to read them over and restrict yourself to only 3. You don't have to rate them. Just pick the 3 that you worry the most about for yourself and your children. Now, some of you don't have children yet, but some of you will, of course, have children in the future. Why don't you pick, we'll just take a couple of minutes and you pick the 3 that you most worry about, or you feel are the greatest risks. We're going to collect these and show you the results near the end of the program. Why don't you pass them to the center and we'll collect them here, and we'll tabulate these results and see what you all are worried about here. I presume that most of you, or at least many of you, are engineers and at least either are or will be designing new products and new processes. There's some new concepts that are really becoming very important these days that people, I think, designing new products and new processes need to understand. One is called sort of the total product life cycle. That really starts with the raw material that you use to build or realize the product. Those get translated into parts, they get or some intermediate phase of their construction through some sort of a process. It gets packaged into something that is shipped or delivered to the customer in. It is used somehow by somebody, and probably at some point in its life it's disposed of. And today, engineers, I think, have to be very careful in thinking about every step of that process. It used to be that you only thought about one or two of those steps. In other words, you're going to make a product that cost a certain amount and that did these things and hoped everybody bought it. Now you have to be really careful about what's going to be the eventual disposal of that product, if it gets disposed of, and it probably will be. One of the things that's a real theme, at least in the firm I'm with, is basically what we call pollution prevention rather than the sort of end-of-pipe syndrome. Before we put in any kind of a process or a part, we ask ourselves, do we really have to do that? Is there a better way to do that that's perhaps environmentally more sound? Recycling in industry, by the way, is very expensive. We, for example, take the residual sludge that comes out of when you get through making a printed circuit board. Printed circuit boards are in just about every electronic product that all of you have, many of. There's a lot of copper in that process, and we collect that sludge and we put them in barrels and we ship them to Idaho to a copper smelter where they're turned back into copper. That's a very expensive process to do that. We do the same thing with solvents that are reprocessed and so forth. If we could somehow figure out a way to avoid having even generated that waste in the first place, we could avoid some costs in there. So we have engineers that are looking at doing that. So the whole concept of product life cycle, I think as engineers you need to think really from sort of cradle to grave with this whole thing. Packaging of products is a terrible problem for landfills. Paper, plastic, the styrofoam, popcorn, things like that. One of the major themes in industry these days is total quality management or total quality control. It's a technique of setting goals, figuring out how you're going to measure whether or not you're achieving your goals, making changes and attempting to have continuous improvement with, of course, the perfection being perfect quality. These concepts apply very well to environmental issues in an industrial environment. What kinds of things are we generating? First of all, do we even know what is happening to it, where it's going to? What are we doing to reduce it? What goals have we set? It's using those kind of general business techniques on these issues here. Education. I guess it probably goes without saying that people who are more educated about whatever subject it happens to be, whether it's science or democracy, tend to make better decisions both for themselves and for society. I think a lot of people need help in being better consumers. I think most people want to be better consumers and they'd like some help. Bill Riley, who's the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, has launched a campaign to try to get some government standard definitions of what do we mean by recyclable or biodegradable. How long does it have to take to degrade before it's biodegradable? Set some standards and help people be able to make those kind of choices. Help people learn how to change their lifestyles. In the Seattle area, just about everybody recycles. One of the big problems they have is they need to teach people the fact that if you throw a bottle in with your aluminum cans, you could ruin a whole batch of aluminum. It doesn't take very much. One piece of yellow paper, by the way, will ruin an entire batch of white office paper being recycled. Did you know that? These are things that knowledge and education can really help people understand. We recycle all our stuff at where I work, and it's been helpful. People have been anxious to know what can be recycled if we are recycling things. We try not to generate it in the first place, like getting rid of plastic and paper in cafeterias. Let me ask you, do you think it's better to when you go to King Soopers, they ask you whether you want paper or plastic, right? I've read some interesting articles by credible people that make strong arguments on both sides of that issue. And frankly, I don't really know. I tend to take the paper because I think that you can probably regrow some trees, but I'm not real comfortable with that.
Bring your own.
Hmm?
Bring your
Bring your own is a much better way to go, right?
Find out if the trees are going from sand bench.
Yeah. Fifth point. Level playing field. I think this is a real important point for our governments, both our national governments and local governments, to try to create an environment where if I'm responsible for running a company, I'm responsible for the paychecks of 2,200 people and their families. Okay? So I'm real careful about doing those things which puts me in a non-competitive position. And most of my competitors are in the Far East, and most of them are in Taiwan. How many of you ever been to Taipei? Well, I don't, unfortunately, I don't recommend it. One of the things that bothers me is I have competitors that over there that dump cadmium in their rivers. The lead levels in children are incredibly high. The infertility rate in Taipei is something like 70% of all childbearing women are infertile there because of poisons from industrial waste. Lead, cadmium, mercury. These toxic chemicals are used to fabricate products cheaper than I can fabricate them in Everett, Washington. Now, if I lose a sale because I am not price competitive, and I throw somebody out of work at my company because my competitor is doing what he's doing in the Far East, I'm feeling really bad about that problem because I don't believe it's right to throw cadmium in the Sammamish River, okay? And we don't do that. But I also feel badly about throwing people out of work. And they think they're making a short-term gain in their costs, and they probably are on a short-term basis. I don't think it's right in the long term. I'd rather do what I'm doing. But you can see the problem I have in a business when there's that kind of international unlevel playing field. The same is true in a lot of other things. Unfortunately, in this country, we have, in many ways, gotten some more level playing fields so that people do have to, at least within one country, do have to play by the rules. And there are international initiatives, for example, the chlorofluorocarbons, try to get some international agreements on reduction and elimination of some of these things. But you can see how important that is to a business who's trying to meet the needs of several different constituents. Let me just summarize and wrap up here with three real, what I would call, nagging concerns. The first is world population growth. This has been a taboo subject for environmental people for some time. It is beginning to reemerge as something we ought to think about. Do you all realize that 5% of the world's population live in this country? We're only 5% of the total world's population. Recent estimates are that the world population will cross through 10 billion people by the end of this century. Now, you know, the thing I worry about is that many people consume a tremendous amount of resources, fuel, products. I think that makes the problem even more urgent. What are we going to do about that? And by the way, most of that population growth is not going to occur in this country where we like to believe we're a little better educated and a little more enlightened. You know where that population growth will occur, and you know what the urgencies are of those people. So this is a worldwide problem. It's not a U.S. problem. The second thing, I believe that as a nation, we are leaving two incredible debts to our children. One we measure, it's called the federal deficit. Now, who's going to pay that back and when? And how much are we going to spend for the interest on that debt? And we at least can measure that, sort of. The other debt we're leaving is what's it going to cost to clean up Rocky Flats and Hanford and all the other DOE places. There have been wild estimates. We're talking about a tremendous amount of money that somebody will have to come up with those dollars to do that job. And probably politicians will push this out into the future on future generations. So I'm concerned about that. The other thing is sort of goes on human nature, which I presume will be a subject of further discussion in some of your other sessions here. But it's the whole idea of getting people to accept short-term pain or inconvenience for some really substantial long-term gains. You know, getting people out of the single occupant car, getting them to sort their trash, simple things like that, getting them to be better informed consumers. They've done a lot of studies that people claim to be environmentally conscious, but when they go to the store, they'll buy based on price, oftentimes. And so, in other words, they're foregoing any short-term pain because it's cheaper and that's better, feels better today. So maybe it's human nature, and maybe that cattle farmer in Brazil is really worrying about the short-term gain, trying to feed his family, but burning down all the rainforest is not the long-term gain. That really concludes my remarks. I don't know that if I said what you thought. I think business, unfortunately, is stereotyped as we're somehow anti-environment. We're not, mainly because in my business, at least, we want a very good environment because we're trying to attract the best brains, because that's our raw material, at least in the business I'm in. And so we'd like a nicer environment. We think that there's a lot more that can be done. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague here. Thank you.
We'll have to find out what the 6th point was.
You know, I misnumbered those. My 6th one was the wrap-up, I guess.
Drag my cord along here with me. You never know what technology you're going to find. Well, there's a lot to agree with in what Bill said, and I will spend some time agreeing with it. But I should start by admitting my reluctance to have Thanasi introduce me as being from the Yale Law School. It's bad enough that I'm from California and that I'm a lawyer, and I don't even know how to tie a respectable necktie. The idea that I'm from a place that's produced at least one person who's lied to 100 million people is kind of nerve-wracking. I don't know which one it is, but it's somebody, and we've all seen them on television. So this is your official warning. You know, watch out. What you say may trick you. Technology and environmental responsibility. When you hear that, or any sort of set of words like that, it's almost not impossible not to hear technology versus environmental responsibility. And in a way, that's what Bill was responding to when saying, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. But the assumption in most people's minds, most journalists' minds, most ordinary readers' minds, is that these two things are in some way opposite. That somehow technology is the enemy of environmental protection. Technology is things like electricity, things that increase our convenience, our ease, increase the capability of people to do things. And since it's things like electricity, that means it's things like nuclear power plants or coal plants. It means it's things like styrofoam clamshells that your burger from the fast food chain comes in. It means it's the 727 that I flew here on this morning to get here. That's technology. And environmentalists are against all those things. Again, that's the assumption. They're always saying we need to use less, or do less, or grow less, or enjoy less. You recognize this description. You've heard various versions of it from a lot of people before. The description's very simple. It's a seesaw. Environment's on one side, economy's on the other. The only way you can help one is to hurt the other. Either way, you can't win. The man most responsible for popularizing that seesaw notion, he never actually bent his arms like that, but he got this across to more people than anybody else, is Ronald Reagan. He ran for president on it. He convinced a lot of people that it was true. James Watt was not anti-environmental. He was pro-economic. He was in favor of economic growth. Ronald Reagan wasn't anti-environmental. He was in favor of the economy. And so, reluctantly, we had to be a little harder on the other end of the seesaw. It was the only way to do it. Now, of course, things have turned around a little bit since Ronald Reagan left office. The environmentalists have won a few, I suppose. But the idea of the seesaw is still very strong. If the environmental side, if the environment wins in some fashion, it must have been at the expense of the economy. It must mean we're growing less fast, responding less quickly, being less competitive internationally. Some form of that. If the Greens are winning, then it's the triumph of the Greens over the greenbacks in some way. Okay, that's the conventional wisdom. You've heard it. Life, of course, is more complicated than that. But let's see how far we can go. I've got 3 questions that I thought I'd play with. The first one is, why is this man smiling? Now, I should have brought the magazine. It's about 1.5 years old. This is the cover of Fortune magazine about 1.5 years ago. The guy on the cover is the chief executive officer of the largest public utility in the country, the largest privately owned, stockholder-owned public utility in the country, Pacific Gas and Electric. It happens to be the one that runs the lights in my house in Northern California. And he's posed, he's got a walking stick and kind of a bright red anorak that he borrowed from the photographer. It's true. And he's beaming. It says, the environment, business joins the new crusade. The second question I have is, why can't you get a hamburger in a styrofoam clamshell anymore at McDonald's? Because you can't. But why not? And the third question I have is, why did one of your senators in this state, Senator Tim Wirth, a Democrat, perhaps even a liberal Democrat, join forces 3 years ago with a Republican senator from Pennsylvania and make a whole set of suggestions about environmental policy and technology which were endorsed by people as far to the left of the political spectrum as Tom Wicker in the New York Times and as far right as the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and in between The Economist magazine? Why? So they're a little different from these 5 points, but there's 3 questions, 3 not burning questions, but questions that might be fun to play with. Let me start with the first one. PG&E, biggest utility in the country. 15 years ago, this company was planning to build 10 of the biggest power plants that you could build, either coal or nuclear, one or the other, and have them all finished by the middle of this decade. Either that or have the lights go out in the northern half of California. We're talking late 70s, and that's exactly what the company thought and what the government officials who regulate the company thought. It was build or die. And a small environmental group, even smaller than it is now, the one I work for, couple of guys with a very primitive computer and a few witnesses who claimed to be technical experts, got up and said in public, in fact in the hearing room, there's a completely different way to cope with this problem. There's a completely different way to build 10 nuclear power plants worth of new electricity. And its name is, and then it kind of got complicated because its name seemed to be a lot of little things all decked together, some conservation over here and some cogeneration over there, a little wind, a little solar, kind of a hodgepodge of different stuff. And the only thing you knew about that stuff is no utility had ever made a large investment in any of it. It was all sort of modern, new wave, soft stuff. And to make it worse, these same environmentalists, including me, I was the lawyer for this, said, and you'll save money. It'll be cheaper for you. So, of course, we had a bitter fight for about 6 years. Lots and lots of cross-examination and briefs and documents and computer runs. Company spent about $2 million trying to fight off this little threat, which I guess was flattery of a kind, since we sure weren't spending that kind of money. We got briefs that said things like it takes a tremendous amount of gall for this little organization to claim that it knows more about running public utilities than we do, because we are the public utility. And then slowly, the company started to shift. And in effect, gracefully and slowly, in the years between then and now, the company has done exactly what was on that odd, weird, radical-sounding little prescription that you couldn't quite understand from the late 70s from this small environmental group. So in effect, what became a very large struggle, this very large company lost. If you're thinking in terms of winning and losing, the environmentalists turned out to be right in some astonishing fashion. Probably they were very lucky. The environmentalists turned out to be right about both the technological availability of all these alternatives and the fact that they were cheaper, lots cheaper. And in fact, they turned out to be so right that the computer model that they built to analyze all this stuff, this company and all the other companies in California now lease from the Environmental Defense Fund to do their in-house analysis. So the question is, why is this guy smiling? And the answer, of course, is it turned out to be very good business. Very good business. His company's stock is doing better than other utilities. He's got less worries about the future. And, of course, he's got a reputation as a pro-environmental major utility, which is not a piece of the industry that is normally thought of as being a leader. Plus, he didn't have to buy the jacket. So, McDonald's. You all know what I'm talking about, the styrofoam clamshell. It's got the two pieces they sort of hook together. I guess if it's a McBLT, you get half in one and half in the other, but if it's a regular burger, you just clunk, put it on top, and you can take it out to the car and do whatever you want with it. You don't think of McDonald's primarily as an educational institution. They sell food. But there are 22 million people a week who go into McDonald's. You know, roughly speaking, 1/10 of the country is in McDonald's every week. What they do gives a lot of people a sense of what's doable and what's appropriate and how society should work. They sell fast food, they sell convenient food, they sell good food, and they're a symbol of the throwaway society. Because as you know, you go in, you buy a burger, and you also buy lots of other stuff that never makes it out the door because it goes into the trash can. But about a year ago, again, my organization, the Environmental Defense Fund, set up a joint project with McDonald's, voluntary on both sides, no money changing hands on either side, but to put our technical experts together with their technical experts to see if maybe there were ways to have less garbage, less solid waste as a part of the business of running the most successful fast food company in the world. And we got that started, and we were busily working away. They visited us, we visited them, all that sort of thing. McDonald's was sensitive about the styrofoam clamshell, so they figured out a way to manufacture it without using CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, the chemicals that hurt the ozone layer. And they were just about to announce that having done that, they were going to reaffirm a marketing strategy to use the styrofoam clamshell. But because we had a relationship with them, we found out about it. And the head of our organization, a very small organization, called up the head of McDonald's, because at least when you've got that kind of relationship, you know the phone number, and got through and said, you know, this could be a very serious mistake. And we should work hard in the next week on showing you what the alternatives are. And to their great credit, 1 week later, the president of McDonald's went on national TV and announced that they were getting rid of the styrofoam clamshell. Not knuckling under to pressure, but because he and his technical people became convinced that, in fact, you could serve burgers and wrap them and retain their heat with packaging that would be about 90% less solid waste. Not perfect, not free, not zero, but about a 90% reduction from the styrofoam clamshell. And so he jumped out and said, that's what we're doing. And they got, as you may have seen, a lot of credit for doing that. So did we. As part of the study, when the rest of the study came out a few weeks later, McDonald's discovered and announced that there were techniques which would allow it to reduce 80% of its total solid waste from all of its operations, not just the selling part, not just the food serving part, but also manufacturing, ordering things. That was very good news too. That's 80% of the total garbage impact of one of the companies, which is seen by the public as being essentially a symbol of the throwaway society, the essence of garbage creation in the course of speed, convenience, and pleasure. Give you an example of how big this company is. They cut down the weight of their drinking straws 20%. They found a way to make them 20% lighter and eliminated 1 million pounds of solid waste a year from that alone. It was a big company. Again, why? Why can't you get the styrofoam clamshell at McDonald's anymore? Good business. Very, very good business for this company. The third question I asked was a little sort of more political and complicated. It wasn't as tangible, about your Senator Tim Wirth and the late Senator Jack Heinz of Pennsylvania. Did a project called Project 88, which got a fair amount of press play, which was a set of recommendations about ways to approach environmental issues, a whole range of issues. And essentially what it displayed was a faith that there are lots of good ideas across the full range of environmental issues, not just little anecdotes, not just little spots here and there, but ways to get at these problems, ways that were good for both the environment and the economy, ways that hadn't been tried just because people weren't thinking about them, because people were still stuck on the seesaw. They still just couldn't figure out how to get that end of the seesaw up without getting this end down. And that got a great deal of positive play because a lot of people would like to see that kind of thing be the case. One of the people who was the audience for that project was a guy named George Bush, who in fact put into his Clean Air Act proposal a proposal on getting rid of 10 million tons of sulfur. That's a little less than half of the total sulfur emissions that cause acid rain. Country's total is about 22 million tons. He proposed to eliminate 10 million tons, put a firm cap on sulfur emissions, with a fairly sophisticated economic trading scheme for how to sort out who would make the cuts and how you'd basically pass out the ability to put the rest of the sulfur into the air. I realize you guys are engineers, not economists, but the basic idea was, let's get the smartest people who can do it the most quickly to do the most and reward them, pay them, by having the people who are slower or dumber or more locked into an inflexible technology be able, in effect, to purchase that creativity in the form of tradable emissions permits. I realize this is a complex concept, but some of you may know about it. Tradable emissions permits capped at a level slightly higher than half of what's coming out the smokestacks right now. Squeeze down, but instead of squeezing down by telling you, and you to go to 0 and everybody else the same, or to tell all of you to come down 42%, instead to say the total's going to come down this much, but we're going to let the intelligence and creativity of the market figure out how. We're going to reward the people who can be quickest, most economic, can go down the most and have some left over. And that's now law. That, in fact, is why the administration had a proposal on clean air in the acid rain context and why it passed the Congress. And we're going to start seeing that start to work very shortly. If it had not been for that proposal, the cost estimates of cutting down that amount of sulfur were approximately $13 billion higher than the cost of doing it this way. And it was because the president and his advisors were convinced that you could do it, in fact, much more cheaply than people thought, that you could have, roughly halve the sulfur emissions in the United States at a much lower price tag, that he was willing to put his administration behind it and make it happen. One of my favorite article describing this whole set of proposals was in The Economist. The headline on the article was "The Greening of the Invisible Hand." Very nice turn of phrase. The English are great at that sort of thing. And that's really what's going on, in a sense, is introducing environmental concepts into very standard economic approaches. There are some people in the environmental movement, some of my colleagues who don't trust this stuff, who think that economics is a dirty word. Economics is the other side's game. Sort of, they think it's not the greening of the invisible hand. They think it's sort of the invisible handling of the greens. But there's beginning to be a consensus that there's real upside here. Why? Again, why did Tim Wirth and Jack Heinz and a bunch of other people do this? Not only good business, but good politics, because it's solution-oriented. It's freeing up a system to be able to search for solutions instead of calcifying problems. Okay, all three of these examples, our friend in the red anorak, and I really apologize, I have to believe me, it's red on the magazine. The McDonald's clamshell, the strange bedfellow's political marriage. In all three of these, it's very clear that technology is not the problem. The problem is the assumption that technology cuts only one way. And also the decisions as to where technology is going to be applied. Is it going to be applied on fluidized bed combustion of coal, or is it going to be applied on getting insulation into people's attics? I oversimplify, but that's a very real issue, and it's a very real issue that was faced by this company over 10 years ago. Is it going to apply to making better styrofoam, or is it going to apply to laminating some paper in a way that increases both its heat retention and its disposability? It's the definition of what is the problem. It's what are the marching orders to the engineers, to the technical experts, as to what they're supposed to be doing. That is where the problem is. By and large, engineers and other technical experts don't make those decisions. They're made by the major players in our economy. They're made by the CEOs, a very enlightened form of which we have right here. They're made by marketing people. They're made by congressmen. They're made by the president, governors, executive agencies. And all of those, in government as much as in business, are capable of missing the issue and missing the point, asking the wrong question. So the key, in effect, is to try to set the incentives in the system to reward going in the direction that we want to go. We all want to go in the direction of things that are both good for the environment and good for continued economic growth and competitiveness. We have a situation, we have a mindset, we have a seesaw notion which does not reward trying to find those things. But there are ways to do that, and some of the questions, we can get into more detail on some of that. One of them was, in fact, this early case, where the reward was simple. The reward was money. Public utilities make their money not from you and me, but from government agencies who tell them how much they can charge you and me. So if you can convince the government agency to reset the pricing structure, you can do anything. There was a very straightforward case of changing the incentives for a large company because, in effect, it had only one customer in response terms, and you could talk to that one customer. The economic approach, the greening of the invisible hand, is really a way of mobilizing technological and entrepreneurial resources in favor of finding ways to do both of these things. Instead of saying, we don't trust trying to protect the environment, we want to hold back, we want to hire our lawyers, we want to fend off the government. Instead, creating a sense of, we'll race you there. We'll try to get there faster because the winner actually profits. One example of that you may have noticed is when StarKist went to dolphin-free tuna, meaning catching tuna without killing dolphins in great numbers when you do it. Another technological fix, incidentally, it has to do with how you set the nets and how you pick them up. They were planning to advertise that as a great advance, and they could barely do it because the other tuna companies made the conversion in about a week. And now it's hard to find a can of tuna that doesn't say dolphin-free on it. When I got off the freeway coming in here, I thought it'd be fun to bring you a styrofoam clamshell. So I stopped at one of McDonald's competitors, and I was very pleased to be told, we don't have those. We don't have any styrofoam at all. So their competition, too. People are following McDonald's lead. They're starting to race each other toward things that are good, both for business and the environment. So that, I think, is a form of very good news, even though it's only early returns. As far as where technology fits in this, the metaphor that comes to mind is a little bit like the people in the time of Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, when the debate, of course, was, does the Earth go around the sun or vice versa? Astronomers were the first scientists, as I'm sure you know. I don't know if any of you have seen the absolutely technologically wonderful diagrams that were made of the solar system to try to defend the Ptolemaic universe, the universe in which the sun went around the Earth and all the planets, all the rest of the planets went around the Earth. As observations got finer and finer, it became necessary to construct more and more elaborate epicycles. And the diagrams toward the end of the period of what the paths of all of the heavenly bodies were so that you could go around the Earth were technological marvels. They were superb. They were magnificent technological achievements. Of course, they were wrong, but they weren't wrong in terms of what the technologists, the astronomers of the day, had been instructed to do. They had really figured out with enormously sophisticated mathematics and thinking a way to make the premise true. And of course, they had been asked the wrong question. And today, with the environment and the economy and technology, I think we're very largely in the same place. The Ronald Reagan notion, the seesaw notion, the idea that we have to scratch at the margin to try to find ways to keep the system as we know it going and protect the environment, is as conceptually wrong as the notion that the sun goes around the Earth. And once we all see that, I think much simpler, much more positive, much stronger advances will be made very quickly, and they'll be made by some of the people in this room. Let me stop there and see if that raises any questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. Before I open the discussion to the floor, I would like to ask you if there is something you feel you want to say to each other.
I'd like to hear from everybody, and then I'm sure we can exchange.
Well, while you think, I can tell you what the results are of our survey. The highest number is hazardous waste, 29, followed by world population growth, mentioned 28 times. 20 people said that personal lifestyle factors like smoking, alcohol, automobile safety, and heart disease is a high risk. 18 thought that healthcare availability and costs. 16 mentioned crime. 15 global warming. A mere 7. I wonder what it would have been like 10 years ago, or even 2 years ago. Nuclear war. Only 7. And pesticides on food were mentioned by 4. This is the most interesting result.
Let's see. Just to recap, hazardous waste, number 1. Hazardous waste, number 1. World population, number 2. Healthcare availability and personal lifestyle, that crime, global warming, and AIDS were tied, declining opportunities and standard of living in the United States, and nuclear war, and then pesticides on food was last. Interesting.
Yes.
We've often heard of the idea of industry of planned obsolescence. Now, that's kind of died down, the publicity on it, but I don't think planned obsolescence has died down. Can you comment on that?
I can. That is a totally bankrupt notion, because you can't be an effective competitor today without very high quality products. And high quality products means lots of things. It means they live a long time, they're reliable, they don't break, they're maintainable. The idea of planned obsolescence is that somehow you have a corner on the market that you can obsolete whatever it is you make such that you can be the person who replaces that. I suppose if you had a monopoly in your business on a worldwide basis, I would add, you might try to get away with that. But I don't think that's frankly don't see people doing that.
I suppose the starkest example of that is automobiles. And the reason that you see an awful lot of Japanese automobiles around is that the United States thought it had a monopoly on cars and behaved accordingly and is now paying the price. Interesting, we'll see what the experience is with the one industry that the United States does seem to have a monopoly on, which is entertainment, the movies. We'll see what happens there.
In lieu of our concern about hazardous waste being the number one problem, what kind of incentives do you think can be put forth to rid companies of the production of those wastes?
Well, let me tell you something that I found quite striking 4 years ago. The CEO of Chevron, one of the biggest oil companies, who was just about to retire, announced that Chevron was going to cut its hazardous waste production by 2/3 worldwide in 5 years, meaning by next year, and save money. Now, a lot of people said, gee, they can't be right, or they must just be doing this for PR. My reaction was, that's extraordinarily good news, because that means that 2/3 of the refinery waste from oil refining worldwide from all companies is utterly unnecessary. If you can get rid of it and save money, in other words, literally make more money not making it than making it, that's terrific. And I've done a lot of work in this area. Source reduction is kind of the buzz phrase for it. It's extraordinary how much potential for source reduction there is. Again, ignored just because it wasn't part of anybody's job description. So once you look, you start finding all sorts of stuff. The new chairman of the board of DuPont has set his company a target of 0 hazardous waste by the year 2000. That's a big company that makes a lot of gunk, or at least has made a lot of gunk in the past. So I think in terms of hazardous waste on this list, I'm interested, a little surprised to see it where it is, but I think the future in this case can be very, very different from the past, even if all you do is make money. We're not even talking about spending a dime more to reduce waste, even if what you do is in your own self-interest, simply make money. Very similar to public utilities making money investing in conservation and cogeneration. It's simply because they didn't know to look. And I think hazardous waste is going to be one of those areas that we'll see very quickly blossom as, gee, we didn't used to look here, but now that we're looking, we're overwhelmed by opportunity. That doesn't solve all the problems, and it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be waste dump problems and there aren't going to be leaking 50-gallon oil drums. But the proportion of the problem projected out into a reasonable midterm future, I think, I think if this survey is done 15 years from now in this room, hazardous waste is going to drop a lot.
I might mention that what is considered hazardous is known. It's legislated. There's a list. You know what they are, and you know what you can and cannot do with these, how you get rid of them, how you dispose of them, who you sell them to, what your responsibility is to the hauler and the ultimate disposer of whatever it is. I'm a little surprised too, because as a practical matter, most really hazardous things are highly regulated, highly controlled, there's a real incentive on the part of business to get rid of using anything that's like this.
Well, here we might actually succeed in having a disagreement. There are a lot of laws about hazardous waste. They work very badly. There is a law that requires hazardous waste to have a ticket, so to speak, from the day it leaves the factory, from the hauler to the storer to the ultimate dump. Every scrap of hazardous waste is supposed to have a ticket called a manifest. When California, which is thought of as one of the toughest environmental states, went looking for those a few years ago, they couldn't find 30% of the tickets. Now, they'd never find anybody for filling out a ticket wrong or for not filling out a ticket, but they literally couldn't find a third of them, much less organize the ones that they could find, which were in shoeboxes. So the notion that you actually could track waste, or if it popped up, you might be able to work back on the tickets, totally bankrupt. If you don't know where 30% of it is, you've got no system of control. That's just to give you a sense of the disparity between the law as Congress writes it and as it's publicized on the day the president signs it and what happens out in the real world. There are other incentive systems going in which are being much more effective, but just because there's a Hazardous Waste Act doesn't mean we're getting anywhere.
I just had a comment or a question on the idea of a level playing field. You started talking about well, Taiwan and Brazil and countries like, well, lesser developed countries. If we're to ask them not to exploit their environments or pollute their and our atmosphere, don't you think I mean, I guess we need to avoid becoming sort of eco-imperialists and perhaps compensate them for the foregone opportunities, the opportunity cost of not having those profits and not developing. So how, maybe private business or through taxation or through debt for nature swaps, things like that?
Well, there have been some really interesting recent developments, and probably David can comment on that too, where people have agreed to let developing companies repay loans by not cutting down forests and trade-offs like that. Now, let me also say that every one of you, all of us, must pay some short-term penalty or cost, probably, to do that. And I would submit that we ought to consider that that's probably worth it. But to an awful lot of people, an extra $50 a year to get a really good education for their kids is too much. So this is where the education can come in. You probably know some other trade-off type deals.
There's been a lot of creativity here, but there's two different issues in what you ask about. Obviously, the stuff I was talking about is stuff which, if you do it, makes the U.S. more competitive with Taiwan, even if Taiwan keeps putting cadmium in its rivers, right? Relatively speaking, if we can do more at lower cost, we are more competitive with the rest of the world, not less, just by those things themselves. So all of that is helpful. Now, there are also situations where countries not as developed put a lower price on their resources, a much lower price, like Brazilian rainforest. The government of Brazil thinks that's worth a lot less than we think the forests around here are worth, for example. And certainly, when you go in and try to do something about that, the biggest mistake you can make is to be an eco-imperialist, to say, hi, I'm from the United States, I'm already rich, you should do this, so I'll stay comfortable. No. My organization does a lot of work down there, and we've got 2 full-time anthropologists on staff, in part to work with the indigenous people and try to develop things to make money out of the rainforest without cutting it down. The rubber tappers, which you probably have heard of, is one example of that. Everybody's heard of the most highly marketed one, which is Ben & Jerry's Rainforest Crunch. That's a fairly small one, but it's an example of the kind of thing that you need to do. You've got to be helpful. You can't simply say, don't do what we did. That's not going to get anywhere.
I would like to add something to that myself, because I think I'm rather sensitive to this eco-imperialism as to others, coming from a less developed country myself. I'm a little suspicious of simple solutions to that. That is to say, to the notion that transfers can take care of the problem, because then you have the very difficult question of who the transfers benefit within the country to which you transfer it. And it generally ends up, in my experience, in some Swiss bank account. So it takes a much more complicated international world, I mean, much more better thought out international world in which these things can be balanced out fairly.
This is one of the clever things about the debt for nature swaps that you mentioned, where you're forgiving third world debt, in effect. Because when that's happened, dollar bills don't change hands, but the pressure on that economy is relieved to some extent. And to the extent that you're trying to boost those economies, that relief of pressure does benefit whatever the economic structure is, which may be unfair in its structure, but it does benefit it on an even-handed basis.
Exactly, perfect. I mean, most of the times they'll be preserve and they won't take into consideration indigenous natives.
We come back to the fact that you have to be smart and you have to be individualized. There is no cookie-cutter answer. Over and over, in all the subjects that I was talking about and that Bill's talking about, there is no simple textbook, read the book, slap it on answer. How to reduce hazardous waste from companies is different for every company. How to generate electricity with, or use conservation is different in every community.
Both of you were trying to tie in economy and technology together, and I was curious on what your thoughts are for research and development. I see a lot of my classmates going into Martin Marietta, the military structure, where the belief of today is you put your money in there and you get a trickle-down technology out of that. Out of the development of a B-2 stealth, you get new circuit boards for IBM to make or something of that nature. I was wondering, along the allocation of money that you were speaking, who makes the decisions for where technology will be applied? What do you think of this? I mean, what do you think of the military budget, per se, in terms of research and development, and how effective that is in terms of creating new and better technology and therefore products?
Well, you know, we got Tang out of the space program. No, it's exactly the point I was trying to make, and I think you're saying the same thing. Who makes those allocation decisions is very important, and what are the incentives on those people? If you're Martin Marietta, your incentive is to sell a lot of big weapon systems. Unless and until the CEO of Martin Marietta figures out that there might be a very good business in consulting companies on how to reduce their hazardous waste. There's no reason Martin Marietta couldn't go into that business. But I would say at the moment, given the institutional structure, that Martin Marietta is probably not likely to make the best decisions on how to allocate technological R&D types of resources if what you're concerned about is lowering environmental impact. That's just a guess.
Right. Well, I guess my question was, what do you think it's going to take to bring about a system change? You see what I'm saying? You're saying right now it's not likely that they're, which I agree. So what do you think would change? What do you think is necessary in changing that?
Well, I tried to describe some things that have already changed. The McDonald's example. I mean, if fast food companies are competing with each other to cut down their garbage, that's not only an enormous change in garbage, because they're responsible for a hefty chunk, but it sends a much more important educational message to everybody else who makes less garbage or is less in the public eye, that there may be opportunities there too. If the biggest utility in the country is busily doing 10 nuclear power plants worth of growth with no power plants and saving money, that sends a message to the other 199 privately held public utilities in the country. It's those kinds of ripple effects and preferably competitive rewards that I think will start to do it. But again, how you flip those levers, how you get those things started, how you start, you know, you light each one of those fuses is different in every case.
I might just add this question of how much of that research done for defense purposes trickles down into commercial products. I think studies have shown that it's marginal. However, certainly that amount of work in this country supports an awful lot of engineers and scientists. I happen to sit next to a guy on the plane who was from San Francisco who's looking at ways of how do you handle the economic dislocation to a community whose whole livelihood is based on either an air base or a weapons plant or something like that. I mean, you can throw them all out of work. What else could they do? In other words, working with them to convert. You know, we talk about the peace dividend, which is great, if we can figure out a way, where are we really going to cut it? If it's your job at a weapons laboratory, you might feel differently about it. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's just a
Well,
point
there's
I was trying to ask about, and that's very.
The jobs issue is very important. And of course, if the answer is nobody can change jobs, then you basically throw up your hands. But you have to separate in the jobs issue what's good for people as a whole and the economy as a whole, and what's good for my job as an engineer at Martin Marietta. The classic example is when Redwood National Park was formed in Northern California. There was a huge outcry about the loss of jobs. We're not going to be able to cut down those redwoods. The whole logging industry is going to go to heck in Humboldt County, California. When the park went in, it wound up creating 5 times as many jobs as the logging jobs that were lost. Now, if you're a logger and your idea is the only thing I can do with my life is log, that doesn't make you very happy. But if you're the Chamber of Commerce of Wairika, maybe you feel differently, that there are 5 times as many jobs and that they are more stable, and you maybe even feel better because they're less destructive of the environment. So you have to, on the jobs issue, my job versus jobs is the thing you need to keep in mind all the time.
I'm very curious to know how you feel about closing the loop. For instance, I wonder how many people in here are writing on recycled paper, recycled legal pads, recycled notebooks, or why you don't have reusable cups on the table, and those, I think, are plastic, if I can tell from here. Or are those signs on recycled paper? And it just, you know, as much as we can run around recycle, it does no good if people are not buying the products. I was wondering, you know.
All that stuff is very important, both for the personal contribution and for just making it seem regular and normal. Most of the legal pads in my office are kind of light gray. This one is an old one, which is why it's yellow. But it should have been light gray. And these certainly should have been paper, which is what the coffee shop in my building now serves coffee in. Or mugs, which is what we do, is take it down and get a discount. Sure. But don't fall into the trap of thinking that that's the only way things change. You could have done an awful lot of bringing your own plate to McDonald's and not had the impact that the events that I described did. The big institutions, when you flip the incentives for them, you can make large steps, and you should never lose sight of the potential for making those large steps, even as we all individually try very hard to use our consumer vote one-on-one.
Just seems hypocritical. You know, I recycle my white paper, but I buy virgin paper. Well, great for you, but, you know, there's some poor tree who's sitting on your desks. So.
Well, another thing that's also very powerful here is that governments can do something as private citizens. The state of California, for example, is required to purchase recycled paper for all of its paper needs if the price is within 10% of the price of virgin paper. Meaning you don't have to spend a fortune, but if it is only a 9% price difference, you got to buy the recycled paper. Well, that made the recycled paper industry 15 years ago in California. It created the recycled paper industry because then it was worth building the mills, setting up the supply, because you knew that the state of California bought an awful lot of paper. They didn't make it illegal for anybody. They just told themselves as an economic actor, buy recycled paper. And you could do that for a lot of other things.
CU has that rule as well, but the departments aren't following through on it. So if there are any department heads here. Go buy recycled paper.
Well, let me tell you that our cafeteria uses cardboard trays, which kind of scandalizes me because they're used for a second and thrown away, where any good piece of plastic, for that matter, durable plastic, could be wiped off. But having said that, yes.
Part of this is education as well, excuse me, because
Yeah.
how many of you recycle batteries?
Rechargeable batteries.
What do you do with rechargeables when they won't recharge?
That doesn't happen.
You will, though. I think as we get more understanding, and we can educate people more, there are a lot of other things in addition that we need to really start being careful of. Rechargeable batteries are nickel-cadmium batteries, and those are hazardous materials.
I thought those could be sent back to factories and they could I don't know, they do something to them.
This is a very important point. The life cycle analysis, the back end of the cycle, takes just as much attention, probably more attention, than the front end, the consumer end. And a lot of times you're in situations where there hasn't been enough attention to that. Japan was very sensitive to batteries, that sort of normal flashlight batteries, because they got mercury in them. And that's one chemical that the Japanese have a very ugly experience with, dating back a number of years. Minamata disease, the famous picture of the 30-year-old son in his mother's arms. So they very, very carefully recycle batteries. You cannot throw away a battery in Japan. They're all carefully collected. The only problem is they're sitting in enormous warehouses. I've seen pictures of 5 acres of batteries, just dead batteries. They do not know what to do with them. So they're mounting up. They're not being thrown away in the normal sense of away. The government's responding to the problem, but they just have enormous warehouses of dead batteries. That's not a full solution either.
Tires are the same way.
Well, on the education thing, there's a recent experience that I will take the privilege of my place to say, and in terms of one of the other hazards, namely health. Going from Boulder to Washington, D.C., where I had to be some time ago, I was absolutely astounded at the number of people smoking. It was just that I wouldn't have noticed, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have noticed. So there is something about people among themselves speaking in certain ways, responding in certain ways, sort of culturally responding, that does make overall an enormous difference. It was a very striking experience. Excuse me, sir.
Automobile manufacturers continually resist the imposition of higher mileage standards. Can you have some comment on it? Is that a case of really arguing that economics is against environment, or who's right on this?
Not according to Toyota.
Or Honda.
The CAFE standards is the environment is even worse on acronyms than most things. That's the phrase for the average fleet efficiency standards. All the cars together that you manufacture have to have at least an efficiency of 27. It is unbelievable that the Bryan bill, which proposed to raise that to 40, was defeated. The cost compared to the savings would just in terms of oil production, if all you were thinking about was oil, it would be by far the cheapest and quickest way to get that amount of oil if you just paid Detroit to raise the CAFE standards to 40 miles a gallon and then simply took the oil that would be saved by all those cars and did something else with it that you might want to do with oil. It's appalling. It is a bet that protectionist forces in the Congress will block out international competition in automobiles. I think it's a losing bet, but that's the bet. We are going to start working with car companies very soon along the lines of our McDonald's project to try to see if by both looking at the technological and economic factors, we can make some headway in convincing them that they're using obsolete reflexes in the same way that McDonald's was using obsolete reflexes. I can't predict that we're going to be as successful, certainly not as fast. They're very different industries, but we're going to give it a try.
That reminds me of a recent example. I think it's Honda who is experimenting with a new technology that eliminates the mufflers. Some of you may have read about this. It uses electronics, digital signal processing, measures the sound coming out of the engine, feeds it around, reverses the polarity, and in essence cancels the sound. Mufflers because they put back pressure on an engine, really hurt the efficiency. So they can produce cars that are quiet with no mufflers and get much better efficiency. Sounds to me like technology there could really change the rules of the game on mileage and sound.
This, incidentally, is a technology that's been in existence for 15 years on submarines and about 15 years on opera houses, using microscopic vibrations to cancel sound waves. You can calculate the incoming sound waves and figure out how to cancel them or amplify them. This is how you can tune opera. There are opera houses now that you can tune differently for every performance. And there are invisible submarines, which hear sonar and vibrate the skin of the submarine microscopically in ways that cancel out the sonar. So the technology's been there. Somebody, maybe even working for Martin Marietta, knew a lot about that technology. It's just new to think about applying it to the end of the tailpipe.
No?
You had a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you have already addressed this issue, but it seems like a lot of the larger companies are reluctant to listen to environmental groups and public interest groups telling them what to do, telling them, even if it's going to save them money, it kind of seems like they don't want to take the advice of somebody else outside of their organization telling them how to change to benefit them. And I was wondering what kind of improved communication would help that, or if you feel that that's a problem.
We probably could both make comments on that. One of the things that's, I think, particularly interesting here is because several of the things that David has said is basically there's a collaboration going on with a general agreement on the objective as opposed to confrontational, I win, you lose. Again, human nature doesn't like it if I win and you lose. Somehow, even if I'm right, you don't feel good about losing, right? But if you and I can agree that there's some problem, and that we may not agree on all the details, it may take us a while to negotiate this and explore it. It's his McDonald's example. You may end up with a better long-term answer. I do think that there are some environmental groups who are so strident as to almost, they hurt their own cause almost. I mean, they're so polarized to, we all should stop driving cars today, we should all stop doing certain things, that it's so unreasonable that you get people on the other side who are just as unreasonable the other way. I don't think that's very constructive. So that's what how to respond to that.
Yeah, you're dealing with a heritage, of course, where this issue didn't exist 30 years ago in any public sense. And the people who cared a lot about it, including the people who founded my organization, sort of had to yell their way into the room. It was not a matter of politeness, it was a matter of we don't need to listen to you. Then they got good at yelling, then they got some laws to help yell with. So now what we're doing is just beginning to get past the stage of that's the dynamic. It's industry versus the environment, which of course then led to the seesaw notion. And there's a lot of old habits. I mean, I am a lawyer. I have sued a lot of companies. And I have done that not because it's fun, but because I know that there is no way to get the attention of a very large company by just being polite. You do need to get attention. You do need to get the CEO to listen. And he doesn't listen to me. He listens to his general counsel who says, gee, boss, I'm sorry, but we're getting beaten out there in court. And unless we do something, something serious is going to happen. I hope that less and less of that is necessary, particularly as credibility on both sides builds. But we are not to the stage where we can simply pool resources and sit down and solve these problems, because there's still, the McDonald's example is a very, very unusual example. The usual reaction is we will deal with these people if they storm the gates and if they get over the barricades and through the boiling oil, and only maybe then. And that still is the sort of mainstream view, I'm afraid, despite the leadership of individual companies. That's why I hope competition can change that.
We'll take one more question.
Going back to the standard with the cars, how come the state or truck companies aren't doing anything about the standards with trucks. The gas mileage with trucks. They're still back to the 19 miles per gallon where cars are up to 35 and 45.
Part of the same thing. I mean, again, there would be great savings. In fact, there are even great savings on stuff that's much simpler, which is that the way the Interstate Commerce Commission regulates, it turns out that a lot of trucks go one way full and come back empty. All you need to do is fill them on the way back, and you've saved an enormous amount of gasoline or diesel fuel. That isn't even with mileage improvements. It's just an example that you reminded me of how inefficiencies in the system, because the incentives are set wrong, can create totally unnecessary environmental impacts.
Why does that it's required by law that car companies have to, try to keep improving the miles per gallon? But why isn't it required on trucks? That's what I don't understand.
The answer is I don't know. The answer is maybe they're even stronger in Congress than the car companies are.
Well, on this unanswerable question, I thank you all. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming.